Hey folks, I'm Pete and this is Pete's Eats Cooking Videos. Today we're making pizza dough. You know, I have a video on how to make the whole pizza, but this is one where we're just going to focus on the dough. I'll tell you a little story. I was in the grocery store the other day. I was buying a few items and this person came in and they were in a panic. Do you have pizza dough? Do you have pizza dough? It sounded like they'd been to a number of stores and I thought, gee whiz, by the time you got in the car and drove around, you could make the dough for a fraction of the price and a heck of a lot better. So I'm going to show you how to make pizza dough. We're going to do it from scratch. It's going to be so easy, delicious. Let's begin. You're going to see this is so easy. All you need is 4 ingredients. You need flour, yeast, salt, and water. That's it. Okay, now about the yeast. There's really only 2 types of yeast you're going to get in the grocery store. One is the traditional yeast and the other is called fast acting. And the only difference is the traditional yeast is in little spheres or little tiny balls, and the fast acting has been crushed up, so it's really increased the surface area of the yeast and it acts a lot more quickly. And so that's really it. The other thing about the yeast is once you use it, if you buy a jar of it, keep it in the fridge, close it tightly so that no moisture gets in there. And the other critical thing about the yeast is use room temperature water. If you use hot water, it could kill the yeast and it's not going to rise. Next, salt. Salt, you need the salt in the dough to give it flavor. But the salt kills the yeast, so you have to be careful with it. What I try and do is I give the yeast flour mixture a bit of a running start, and then I add the salt in a bit later. I think it helps it out a bit. Lastly, the water. Really, I use regular tap water, and the only thing you need to be careful about is room temperature, not hot water, or you'll kill the yeast. Once you're done making the dough, you can put it in the fridge in a Ziploc bag and it'll be good for a couple days for sure. Or it freezes really well, so you can make a big batch and freeze a bunch of dough packages and you'll have it ready for the next time you want to make a pizza. The other thing about the dough is once you get into a cycle of making pizza dough, you can take some of that dough out of the fridge when you're making your batch and throw some of that dough right in the mixture. It gives it a bit of a richer taste. I want to talk about the rise. You have to realize that this is like a chemical reaction. So we can control the rate of the reaction by controlling the temperature. You definitely don't want your dough to be rising in a cold temperature environment or drafty environment. You want it nice and warm, not hot, just nice and warm. A good place to put the dough is covered in the oven with just the light on, and that gives it a really nice warm temperature for it to rise effectively. So remember, you control the rate by controlling the temperature. So what I'm going to do now is make a batch for 1 large pizza, and I'm going to use the fast acting yeast. So what I do is I put a good heaping cup of flour into the bowl, and then I'm going to add 1 teaspoon of fast acting yeast. I guess that's a good teaspoon. Of course, depending on the yeast, if the yeast is old, it won't be as effective and you might have to use more. So I'm just going to mix that up, the flour and the yeast together. Okay, and then I'm going to pour the full amount of water in there, which is about 1 1/4 to 1 1/2 cups of water, room temperature. I'm going to mix that up, and that's going to be really wet. And now what I do is I leave this and give it about 5 minutes to act, give the yeast a running start before I add the salt and the remainder of the flour. Okay, so that's been about 5 minutes for the yeast to give a running start. Now what I'm going to do is add another good cup of flour in and the salt. So about a teaspoon of salt. And we'll mix that up and hopefully we'll get a nice dough out of this. A little bit, I think, on the wet side still. So people add a bit more flour. In the end, it's going to be about 3 cups at least of flour in the mixture. But now I can turn this out onto the tabletop. So I'm going to pour this out onto the table so I can knead it. Of course, you can knead it right in the bowl if you want, no problem. Most people don't like doing it in the bowl. They like doing it on a tabletop. Another really handy tool when you're doing this is a dough scraper, any kind of flat surface. I have a plastic one I really, really like. I've had for years. Okay, I'm going to put a bit more flour on here, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of start kneading it with the dough scraper because it is really soft and sticky. And I'll let that go for a bit. Okay, I think now I'm ready. I'm going to actually knead it with my hands. And there's nothing, it's very therapeutic actually kneading. Just turn and roll, turn and roll, turn and roll. Oh, it's a little sticky, so and put a bit more flour. Although, probably one of the biggest mistakes newbies make when they're making dough is they add too much flour because they're afraid it's too sticky. But that's okay, it'll turn out anyway. So what you need to do is knead this, turn and fold for about 5 to 10 minutes. And once it fights you back and you kind of feel it pushing up against you, it comes together nicely, then it'll be ready for the rise. So I'll meet you in about 5 minutes on the other side of this kneading. So there you go. I've kneaded it for over 5 minutes. It's really acting nicely as one sort of solid dough. I'm going to cover it now. You can either cover it with, this one has a nice cap for it, this bowl, or you can use plastic cling wrap, or you can put a damp towel over it. And we're gonna let that rise now for about an hour and a half, and then it'll be ready. So here's the dough after it's risen for a good hour and a half. You can see there's nice bubbles in the dough and it's gonna be nice and soft. So when we open it up, you'll see the key is they normally say it doubles in size. If it doubles in size, you're done, right? And you see how nice and soft it's turned. So I'm ready to make a pizza with this. And what I'm gonna do is, see those beautiful, beautiful bubbles in there. I'm gonna put this out on the surface with a little bit of flour. And I am ready to make my pizza. As a matter of fact, I have more than enough for a large pizza, and I'm going to then put some aside for the next time I make dough. With the traditional yeast, which are the little spherical granules, what we do is we put the water in with the yeast, and we let that sit, the full amount of water, we let that sit for about 5 to 10 minutes. So those granules can soften up. And since I have dough, I'm going to put a couple pieces of old dough in here. That will really help the taste, and that'll soften up in the water. So here's the traditional yeast with some additional extra dough I threw in there. From here, it's the same process. I'm going to put in half of the flour, and I'm going to let that go for about 5 minutes, and then I'll add the remainder of the flour and the salt and knead it. It's exactly the same from here, so no big deal. Don't be intimidated. Any way you do it, I'm sure it'll turn out as long as the water's not too hot. Okay, so to summarize the difference when using traditional yeast, you have to let the granules soften for about 5 minutes in the water, and then add half of the flour, again, a second weight so that you can give that yeast a running start, and then you add the remainder of the flour and salt, just like in the other one, knead it, and away you go, you're off to the races. And if you want any guidance on making the whole pizza, nice sauce and toppings, see my Pete's Eats Pizza video. Enjoy, good luck!